Hello, First Baptist Church family. It is Good Friday this Holy Week. If you are having the opportunity to watch this video live, it is, as it premieres, it is 3 o'clock Friday afternoon, which Scripture tells us is the exact moment that Jesus gave up his life on the cross. And I thought that was the perfect time to come together to take a couple minutes and reflect on just how much Jesus suffered for you and I on that Friday. Because we come together on Palm Sunday, we celebrate Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, and the people excited for their conquering hero finally arriving to set them free. And then we move ahead and we get together, we gather on Thursday evening for our Maundy Thursday meal as we celebrate the Seder meal and the first Passover, and that night that Jesus gathered with his disciples for the Last Supper. And then we leave here on Thursday and we start looking forward. We get excited for Easter morning, for Jesus' glorious resurrection. We so often tend to overlook the dramatic events that took place on that Friday. In the Gospel of Matthew, it tells us that they spit in Jesus' face and struck him. And someone slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate, the governor. And then the Gospel of John continues and says, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe." We read those things, we hear those things so often. But I wanted us to really take a couple moments and get a full picture of just everything that Jesus suffered for you and I on that Friday. The description I'll be reading comes from The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. As he says, Jesus went with his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane. He prayed all night. Since he knew the amount of suffering he was going to endure, he was quite naturally experiencing a great deal of psychological stress. This Gospels describe Jesus as sweating blood, which is a known medical condition called hematoroidosis. It's associated with a high degree of psychological stress. Severe anxiety causes the release of chemicals that break down the capillaries in the sweat gland. As a result, there's a small amount of bleeding into the glands, and sweat comes out tinged with blood. What this did then was set up the skin to become extremely fragile, so that when Jesus was flogged by the Roman soldiers, his skin would be very, very sensitive. Roman floggings were known to be terribly brutal. They usually consisted of 39 lashes, but frequently were a lot more than that. The soldiers would use a whip of braided leather thongs with metal balls woven into them. When the whip would strike the flesh, these balls would cause deep bruises, which would break open with further blows. And the whip had pieces of sharp bone in it as well, which would cut the flesh severely. The back would be so shredded that part of the spine was sometimes exposed by the deep, deep cut. The whipping would have gone all the way from the shoulders down to the back and the buttocks and the back of the legs. As the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. The sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. When he arrived at the site of the crucifixion, he was laid down, and his hands would have been nailed in the outstretched position to the horizontal beam. It was separate from the vertical beam, which was permanently set in the ground. The Romans used spikes that were 5 to 7 inches long and tempered to a sharp point. They were driven through the wrists, because the wrists were held in a solid position that would lock the hand in place. The nail would go through the place where the median nerve runs. This is the largest nerve going out of the hand, and it would be crushed by the nail that was being pounded in. When you hit your funny bone, it's actually a nerve called the ulnar nerve. Think about when you hit that. And then think of taking a pair of pliers and squeezing and crushing that nerve. The pain would be absolutely unbearable. In fact, it was literally beyond words to describe. At this point, Jesus was hoisted at the crossbar, and the crossbar was then attached to the vertical stake, and those nails were driven through Jesus' feet. Again, the nerves in his feet would have been crushed, and there would have been a similar type of pain. His arms would have been immediately stretched out, probably about 6 inches in length, and both shoulders would have been dislocated. This fulfills the prophecy in Psalm 22, which foretold of the crucifixion when it says, "My bones are out of joint." Once a person is hanging in the vertical position, crucifixion is essentially an agonizing, slow death by asphyxiation. The stress on the muscles and the diaphragm put the chest into the inhaled position. In order to exhale, the individual must push up on his feet so the tension on the muscles would ease for just a moment. In doing so, the nail would tear through the foot, eventually locking up the tarsal bones. After managing to exhale, the person would then be able to relax down and take another breath in. Again, he'd have to push himself up to exhale, scraping his bloody back against the coarse wood on the cross. This would go on and on until complete exhaustion would take over, and the person wouldn't be able to push up and breathe anymore. As the person slows down his breathing, he goes into what's called respiratory acidosis, which is when the carbon dioxide in the blood is dissolved, causing the acidity level of the blood to increase. This eventually leads to an irregular heartbeat. With his heart beating erratically, Jesus would have known at the moment of his death, which is when he said, "Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit." Then he died of cardiac arrest. If the story ends there, it's a story of sadness, tragedy. But we know the story doesn't end there. I encourage you all to join us this Sunday morning right here at First Baptist at 10 a.m. as we come together and celebrate the rest of the story of Jesus Christ's glorious resurrection from the grave.